they wouldn't be able to join us. Rex, are you on the phone yet? Okay. I know we have a little bit of housekeeping business relative to the workshop that we should probably go over to begin with. Maybe we'll start with that as Rex is going to be joining us here in a minute. The agenda for the next hour is pretty brief. We'll have some updates from Max relative to where we're at with our September workshop, and then the primary purpose for today's call is going to be to hear from Rex on the topic accountability in conservation, and he's got a very interesting PowerPoint that he's going to share with us. And I know that Rex's objective here was to have this a dialogue, not just a lecture, so when he gets on the phone he can tell us a little bit more about that. But maybe Max, if we could start with you.
Okay.
I could just advance this, and you could give us a little bit of background on where we're at with the workshop. Oh, okay, Rex. Max has got 2 slides, and then we'll roll it over to you.
Okay. So I just wanted to go over some logistics and provide a little heads up regarding our workshop in September. We sent out a doodle poll, and we decided that September 11th through the 13th worked for the largest group of people. So that'll be held at the Fish and Wildlife Service office in Bismarck, September 11th through the 13th. I sent out some information about hotel rooms. Mike blocked out 10 to 12 rooms at the Ramada, right, Mike?
Yeah, it's just a block and a half up the street from our office.
Okay, and when are those rooms being held until?
I believe she said the 1st of September, so we've got some time.
Got plenty of time.
Yeah.
I also wanted to remind folks that if you need any travel assistance, you can contact me, and we can try to work that out. So I do have some money to help people attend the workshop if need be. I've heard from 3 people so far. Now, the last thing here that I wanted to just quickly discuss is because the workshop's only 3 days long, we'd like to try to be really efficient. So we're planning to schedule 2 conference calls prior to the workshop, and I'll be sending out a poll soon to try and see if we can maybe firm up these dates. But right now we're sort of ballparking for the week of August 13th and the week of August 27th for those calls. And we're planning on each of those being about an hour. Now, Mike, there is a conflict potentially. Is that right?
Yeah, the last week of August. I'm not sure what the actual time is going to be, but we do have a meeting of our steering committee that week in conjunction with the JV meeting that's going to happen at the same time.
Okay. So that might have to be adjusted. But again, we'll be sending out more specific information. But I'd like to just discuss a couple things about those calls so that you guys have a better idea of where we're going to go when we are at the workshop in Bismarck. So mainly we'd like to try to pick up where we left the last workshop, but we'd really like to try to get more into trying to decide on a decision problem that's more specific, that all the partners can kind of agree on and focus on. And we'd like to focus a bit more on the specific objectives and decisions of the partners. One of the things that we'd like to do with this call is to go back, or with these 2 calls, is to go back and basically see if we really need to revise this decision problem. Is everybody comfortable with where we're trying to go? Is everybody comfortable with the objectives? In addition to that, we'd really like to get a better idea of what the decisions are that we're all sort of bringing to the table in this partnership. So again, I just wanted to give a heads up that these are the types of things that we're going to be discussing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions individually, either phone or via email. I know that we need to get to Rex's presentation, so I don't want to take up any more time with that. But I just wanted to give everybody a heads up.
Max, are we going back to the 22? I don't know if is this the proper protocol to ask a question?
Yeah. Go ahead, Rex.
Like, sure. Are we going back to the original set of information priorities that were established, or are we starting with the much more general set?
Well, that's a good question, actually. I think that what we had talked about doing was going back with the general set and saying, where did we miss the mark with this general set? Or did we miss the mark with this general set? And do we really need to go back to the specific set? And did we even get that part right? So there's going to be a lot of chance for revision here, I think.
Could you send that set of 5 general questions out again, Mike, so that we have those handy?
I'm sorry, I might have lost you there, Rex. The 5 questions relative.
The five questions that we left the steering committee with that we used.
Oh, sure. I will, and I'll do that as part of the notes from this call, Rex. And if you could click on share my desktop, there you go.
Just did it.
And now we've basically got your PowerPoint up.
All right. Well, Mike tells me there's a 4-second delay roughly between when I advance a slide and when you can all see it. So if I start to get too far ahead, please let me know.
Now, Rex, we were waiting for you to join us, I was telling folks that when we talked about this a day or two ago, you want this to be a dialogue as much as possible and not a lecture. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
All right.
I don't give lectures anymore. But I'll just jump into it. Much of this is going to be familiar to people. Certainly there's nothing here that's revolutionary. It's just perhaps a way to put it back in the front part of our brain. I won't say the frontal lobe, but the purpose, of course, is all the LCCs, the PPP LCC included, is to increase the efficiency of the conservation that our respective agencies and organizations do, and that's mainly by attempting to address applications of science to uncertainties in the management process. Now, the title is accountability, and that's what Mike and Rick and I agreed I would talk about, but it's going to be very evident that accountability and objectives and monitoring and efficiency are all inextricably related to each other. They're all basically parts of the same process. And we want to be as sure as we can, we're being as efficient as we can with imperfect knowledge and incomplete control, and all of them play a critical role. Now, I'm going to define efficiency one time, and then I'll assume that we all can acknowledge that efficiency is whatever outcome we're trying to achieve relative to its cost. Now, there's lots of ways to measure cost. You could measure costs in dollars expended. You could measure cost in acres encumbered. You can measure cost in political capital expended. And all of those are valid. And so you've got to be cautious when you define efficiency as part of your objective function. But for our purposes, I'm going to leave that to you and assume that you have your own definition of efficiency. I don't think it matters for the purposes of the rest of this talk. This is a very self-explanatory slide. There, can everyone see that now?
Yep.
Okay, good. And it's kind of a tried and true, or maybe a little bit tired statement. You can't be held accountable, in other words, if you don't have any upfront statements about what you're going to try to accomplish. And when we make upfront statements about what we want to accomplish, I think that's an objective. Also, in my opinion, in certain circumstances, there's often a fear of failing to accomplish our objectives, but failing to accomplish our objectives can be useful. In fact, I had a conversation 6 or 7 years ago now, and you get to be my age, the years kind of run together, with Mike Hickey, who was our OMB examiner when we first adopted the PART goals, Program Assessment Rating Tool goals for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Migratory Bird Program had some goals that it was obvious that we simply didn't have the authorities or the resources to accomplish. And I told Mike candidly that we were going to fail gloriously, and he said that was fine. He expected that, because that was a way of doing, if nothing else, of demonstrating the additional capacities or efficiencies that we needed. So I don't think we should be afraid of failing to achieve our objectives, as long as we understand why we failed to achieve our objectives. Now, when we talk about objectives in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'll be careful to caveat this statement with that, we've tried to move away from what for years were traditional objectives like the one here: conserve 1,450 acres of wetlands. And the reason for that is that these old style of activity-based objectives don't tend to acknowledge what our real mission is. And we've switched from those to in favor of what we refer to as mission or outcome-based objectives. Now, it doesn't mean there's not any role for activity-based objectives. It simply means it's not what we lead with. For instance, conserving 1,450 acres of wetlands is not the objective of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Our objective in restoring those wetlands is to restore the fish, wildlife, and plants that depend upon those, and the other ecological services that they provide. So we want to be explicit about how those organisms relate to wetlands, and saying conserve 1,450 acres of wetlands doesn't acknowledge the fact that all wetlands are not equal for different functions. Different types of wetlands have different functions and values. So instead of activity-based objectives like these, we have adopted outcome-based objectives. And I think you've all seen these, and they've caused a lot of anxiety, I think, lately. And I think most of that anxiety is probably unnecessary. There are several examples that I've given here. 2 for wildlife and 1 for removing tons of sediment, it could be phosphorus or whatever, from the Minnesota River. The only requirements of outcome or mission-based objectives is that they be, 1, mission-oriented, obviously, and each of our organizations probably has a slightly different mission that we should not be sacrificing to be members of this partnership. We should respect what our unique missions are, and the challenge of the LCC is trying to figure out how to mesh those respective objectives that are couched in different missions. The second thing that mission-oriented objectives have to be is they have to be measurable. Now, how do you measure those? That's a real good question. There's this pervasive myth, I think, that people are afraid of, is that when we say you have to have an objective for wildlife anyway, it has to be a number of animals. And good Lord, how do you determine a number of animals or plants? That's not true. It's a good goal when you can do that, when you have the information about the condition of the habitat and its landscape context to enable you to make predictions about numbers of animals. But the objective has to be expressed to be measurable in the same units that we use to estimate actual outcomes. Now, how do you think we're going to actually estimate outcomes? Anybody want to forward a guess? How are we going to estimate actual outcomes?
Models.
All right, well, I'll give you my opinion. We're going to use models to estimate our actual outcomes. Models that reflect data that has often been gathered over years and therefore produces estimates that reflect something like a mean condition, or they may be experience-based expressions of models. We all use models every day, of course, to help us decide where to hunt, where to fish, where to park, to get the in and out of the grocery store most efficiently, etc. I mean, the models are a basic decision tool that we all use, and they are going to define the objectives of the units of our objectives. Also, I want to say at this point that I hope that in the LCC we won't go down the road of trying to develop our own objectives, at least if there's another group that's already developed those objectives, and be they a group of states or a joint venture in the case of birds, or fish habitat partnership, and those objectives are already accepted. I don't think we need competing or dueling sets of objectives. So let's take a look at this question of using models. For wildlife, sometimes there's data that exists to estimate the absolute abundance, or in the case of a few species, even vital rates like survival rates or recruitment rates. But usually our information is more limited than that. In fact, I've been involved in creating a number of models that are based on the experience of a few individuals and then gone out and validated in the field by taking people out and having them describe what constitutes good habitat. But good habitat is a long way from how many organisms are going to occupy a particular site. So in practice, many of our outcome-based objectives are going to be expressed as something like the percent of a landscape that is highly suitable, and we have to define highly, of course, to be explicit. Let's say has a more than 60% probability of occurrence of a species. That is a perfectly good objective if that's all I can predict with my models, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. One example right here is increasing the average annual probability of occurrence of breeding pallid sturgeon to greater than or equal to 70% in the lower Yellowstone River. So the data,
yeah. I have a question for you.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So you have a statement here that says your models define your objectives.
Right.
And I guess my question for you is, shouldn't that be the other way around? Shouldn't it be your objectives defining what kind of model you think you might need to make that sort of prediction?
I think ultimately, you're right. Ultimately, what you want to aspire to is saying, all right, I want to be able to express my objectives in terms of vital rates and population abundance, let's say. Mm-hmm. That's where we are with waterfowl. And therefore, I need models that will predict those. Mm-hmm. But if my turnaround time for accountability is in 1 year increments or 2 or 3 year time steps, It often takes a lot more data and a lot more time to collect those models, collect the data necessary to create those models than 1 or 2 years.
Sure.
And so you're going to have to start with what you've got.
Okay, so what I kind of hear you saying then is that there needs to sort of be a dialogue between your objectives and your models.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And this is what I mean by inextricably linked.
Right.
You can't have one without the other. And almost everything, when we talk about strategic conservation or whatever name you want to apply to it, almost everything there is an iterative back and forth process where one part informs the other part. And it's not a linear combination of elements by any means. So the data that you have or the data that you don't have are going to define what your model units are. And then, at least initially, if you're data poor anyway, your models are going to define the terms of your objectives. And we have to be clear with our leadership that we're not always going to be able to provide reliable predictions of numbers of organisms. Sometimes it's going to be things like relative suitability of the landscape, or the proportion of the landscape that's a certain threshold level of relative habitat suitability, according to our models. Yeah, I think that's sufficient on that point. Let me move on to a slide here that everyone who's ever heard me talk before has probably seen. This is the infamous thunderstorm map, in this case from Minnesota. What's important here is this regression shown on the right, which predicts pairs of ducks, in this case mallards, as a function of the water regime of a wetland and the size of that wetland. So how could we express our objective if we had a model like this? If we could predict the number of, if we know where all the wetlands are, and we could predict the number of ducks on each of those wetlands using this regression, how could we express, what units could we express an objective in? Couldn't we express our objectives in terms of number of ducks in a landscape in a defined area? Sure. We could, right. Or at least that could be part of our objective. We might want to go beyond that. Say something about how those ducks fare while they exist within that landscape. But at least part of our objective could be, with this kind of information, this kind of a model, which required quite a bit of data to create, and we update it with additional data every year. It could be how many ducks we have in a defined area. Now, the advantage of that is that lets us look at the landscape and talk about efficiency in very explicit terms. This is one particular county in Minnesota. The blue areas here have an estimated 2 pairs per square mile of breeding dabbling ducks, whereas the red areas have about 40 pairs per square mile of breeding dabbling ducks. And the ratio of those two, 40 pairs to 2 pair, indicates that if we work in the red areas, we have about a 40-fold increase in efficiency, all things being equal, costs of projects, etc., if efficiency is outcomes relative to cost. So that's the advantage of models like that, and using models, really models of any kind, for accountability and efficiency, is it lets us be fairly explicit about the efficiency that we're gaining over a more random approach to habitat management. Now let me move to a different kind of model. This is a model for prairie chickens that some of you may have seen. It was developed by Diane Grandforth when she was with the Hafford office. And if you look at, you can ignore the model there, but take a look at the relative, the scale there in the middle. It's a less sophisticated model because it's based on less data. It's actually based on the distribution of persistent booming grounds of prairie chickens. And the colors shown in that scale are the probability of any particular pixel supporting a booming ground. I'm explaining that badly. It's the probability of the landscape being suitable at that location to sustain a booming ground in that area. Okay? So this is the only kind of model that we had, and we have lots of models like these. In fact, there are places like the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture that have never developed models that do more than predict relative habitat suitability, or at least didn't for many years. How would we express our objective for prairie chickens in this case? We already said it earlier. We might say the proportion of the landscape that's at least 60% apparent suitability for the presence of a booming ground for prairie chickens. That would meet all the requirements of our objectives. It's driven by the output of our models. It's measurable because of the presence of our models, and it's mission oriented. So that would be a fine objective. We don't, and no one has ever said we're going to have 5,000 prairie chickens in this landscape. All we've ever said in this case is that based on the information that we have, we want 70% or more of the landscape to be more than 60% suitable for booming, to support booming grounds for prairie chickens. So, very straightforward, units driven by the models. Okay. Moreover, on top of all this, objectives are not just written at regional scales. Objectives are often written at least 2 to 3 scales. They're written at the project scale more and more often. We're being asked, before project money, before funding is being provided, what are the biological or ecological outcomes of this project going to be? In other words, this is how we decide if a project is going to be worth the cost. How are we going to estimate what the biological outcomes of that project are going to be? We're probably going to use a model, right? And then periodically, we're going to be asked to develop objectives for an ecological region. And the way that we may do that is we may apply models to remotely sensed data to assess what our current status is and use that as a foundation for deciding what we want our future status of that population to be. Now, one point to make here is that models are usually very different but usually different for different ecological regions. We have 2 fairly distinctly different ecological regions in the PPP LCC. We have the Northern Great Plains and we have the Prairie Pothole region. And it's unlikely that even if a species inhabits those 2 regions, its ecological relationship with its habitat is going to be the same. So we might need 2 models there for the same facet of a species life cycle if it occurs in both regions. And then very often we have to have a range-wide population objective for an endangered species, or even a species that's just socioeconomically important, or even one that's not socioeconomically important, but we want to know what the status of that population is relative to what we perceive society wants it to be. And other population objectives scales are possible. We're routinely now being asked to come up with population objectives for wetland management districts or refuges in their comprehensive conservation planning process. So the key to remember here is it's often, or even usually, I think, the same model that's used to write the objectives at each scale, because the model is really applied always at a small spatial scale, the scale of the individual habitat unit, the patch of grass, the wetland, etc. And when we try to assess where we are at a range-wide scale, what we do is we aggregate those small scale predictions up. And of course, what does error do when you scale up? Error compounds. So we would expect our regional estimates to be less precise than we would our project-specific estimates.
You know, Rex, that you bring up a good point there, and one of the things that comes up, it seems like again and again whenever we use models, is to understand those assumptions, such as scaling up and potential concerns with that aspect of the use of a model. And isn't that a piece of this accountability discussion as well, and understanding those assumptions that go into these models?
Yeah, we're going to get to that in just a second, Mike.
All right. And this is your time check, by the way. It's about 25 to 3.
Okay. I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit here. So how do we estimate our accomplishments or progress? At the project scale, we routinely get asked the question now by groups like NACA, okay, so tell me what did you accomplish with the money that we gave you? Fish and Wildlife Service is asking that. OMB is asking that. I think amongst funding groups, there's often a sense that we can go out and we can count the organisms on a project, and that will tell them what the biological outcome of that project was. Of course, there's a fallacy in that, because what does it mean if you go out to a project area and you drive up to it and there's nothing, there's no, let's say we're working on black terns. You drive up to a project site and there's no black terns in sight. What does that mean? It means nothing. Because 5 minutes after you drive away, a black tern might show up, or 100 of them might show up. So what you're required to do in that case is you go back over and over and over again and come up with some mean number of observations. Well, there's an alternative to that, and that is to spread those observations out in space and in time so that you can extrapolate your estimates to a much larger region like the Prairie Baja region or the Northern Great Plains. In the case of ecological regions or range, I started to talk about this earlier, we apply our models to remotely sensed data like satellite imagery, being cognizant of the fact that change detection from satellite imagery is very difficult, and you can have problems with exponentially compounding errors associated with that. So again, we're using the same models to assess what is the outcome at the project scale, and as we are, what is the status of the population relative to its range-wide population objective. At the project scale, in other words, I'm not advocating going out and counting animals. I'm advocating using models to estimate what we get from our project. Spatial variation, I said let's spread out these samples and spread the burden of monitoring to refine our models and make them better in the future, or to create them initially. It also makes them more robust to spatial variability. Temporal variation is essentially uncontrollable environmental variation, and how do we deal with that? We deal with that by spreading out our counts, our observations, our monitoring in time, and we do that by having lots of observations, increasing our sample size. With that said, again, I wouldn't want to use the same model for the prairie pothole region in the northern Great Plains, even though I advocate spreading them out in space. Ecologically, the two regions are too different. Now, it should be clear that we're using the same models for biological planning as we are to estimate outcomes at the project scale and progress toward regional objectives, which we can call both accountability. But there's a caveat here. We need to periodically go back and review our outcomes to refine our models. And so we do that on an annual basis with our 4 square mile survey for waterfowl. But in other words, models can't be built and then set on a shelf and pulled out and used to estimate outcomes. They have to be periodically evaluated to incorporate that annual variation, especially if we're not dealing with ecological stasis. If there's variation going on, or there's a trend going on, and as there might be with climate change, we have to be concerned about ecological relationships changing and models becoming outdated. So this is an example of using biological models that we use for planning. That's the very same Poisson regression down there at the bottom that we use to identify priority areas for management. We use those to assess what our program accomplishments were, or what our accomplishments were in a county or in a wetland management district or whatever area we define. And we do that by, again, estimating the number of birds that are going to occur on a wetland that we restore. The red cross-hatched areas are drained wetlands. The blue areas are some wetlands that we restored in a 4 square mile area. In this case, the total number of pairs restored is 25.7. That's the kind of accountability that OMB and the GAO want to see. They don't want to hear that we restored a total of 14 acres of wetlands. They want to know what did you get for the restoration of those 14 acres of wetlands. I remember going to Washington, D.C. and having the North American plan touted as having now spent $1 billion of partner money as an accomplishment. And I said to my boss, only in Washington would you call spending $1 billion an accomplishment. That's a mechanism toward an accomplishment, but certainly not an accomplishment. So it's also clear that we don't do evaluation every year on every site. We obviously look at a subset of our project sites. If we want to evaluate our status at a regional scale, we apply models to change in land cover and wetlands over time. We might do it every 5 or 10 years, or with significant policy changes. So for instance, in the case of our prairie chicken model, we have a landscape on the left with the 2010 distribution of CRP, and we see the predicted landscape distribution of prairie chicken booming grounds, or more accurately, the probability of occurrence in the landscape with CRP that's expected to be unexpired in 2015. So anytime that we want to assess our population status, we can go in and we can pull new remotely sensed data, run our models on that, and assess our progress toward our population objective, that being our accountability, or do the same thing with policy changes, as this illustration shows.
Rex, this is Justin. I got a question about that.
Sure.
So, at what point then is there room for going out and actually doing surveys to see if those booming grounds are still there? Or with your example of the wetland restoration.
You can do them every year, Jeff, or you can do them every few years. But when you do them every few years, you lose it's particularly in dynamic environments like the prairie pothole region where things can be really wet and then really dry. If it's a wetland-dependent species, for instance, you lose the ability to detect those extreme climatological events or weather events.
So you're saying the model predictions then are the measure of accountability?
Absolutely.
But why isn't the measure of accountability the results from the survey?
Because
like instead of the prediction for how many pairs duck nesting or duck nests or nesting pairs, you go out and do a survey of those wetlands that were restored and see how many ducks are there. Why would you not do that instead of just making a prediction from the model?
Because next year when you go back and do that, you might have a tenth the number. Let's say instead of number of duck nests, we were interested in duck nesting success. 1 year duck nesting success can be 2%, the next year it can be 40% for no explicable reason. But if you spread out many observations in space and time, and you find predictor variables that let you estimate what factors might be influencing duck nesting success so that you can do more than provide a simple mean, you can do something more sophisticated, you're going to get a better estimate. You understand what I'm talking about?
So then you're pretty confident that the models that you fit to the data are accurate. They give you accurate predictions.
Every model is wrong. But they're probably better than a single year or single event's observation of a particular site.
But I think what Justin's also reiterating here, Rex, is the importance of the monitoring component of the SHC circle.
Absolutely. And you've got to go back, as I said, and you've got to periodically monitor a subset of those sites. You don't have to monitor every site, but you've got to monitor a subset of those sites, and you've got to try to determine whether or not you've got to collect data that is incorporated with that other, with the rest of your long-term data. And we, for instance, create a new regression for various species at about 5-year intervals. The models aren't static by any means. And in fact, you may want to go back and rerun your models on what you counted as your previous accomplishments, because you may find you did better than you predicted with an older version of the model, or you may not have done as well.
Hey Rex, you got about 10 minutes if you want to leave some time for Q&A.
Yep. So anyway, we got science as a body of knowledge, the stuff we learn in school, and then of course there's science as a means of learning. And of course science is both. And our goal is to use both learning and science as a body of knowledge to make our management more efficient. So let's take a look here at science as a means of learning. The business that we're in is always going to work with imperfect information. We're never going to have perfect information. And we're never going to have perfect controllability over the systems that we manage. So we're always going to be working with in the process of planning and managing, we're always going to be confronted with uncertainties, things that we simply don't understand about how the system functions. When we're confronted with an uncertainty, what do?
Ignore it?
Well,
make assumptions.
Make assumptions, yeah, absolutely. We have to make assumptions. Some of those assumptions are going to be pretty reliable. We're not going to have to really wonder about whether or not that assumption is accurate. We're going to be pretty confident in that. Some of them aren't going to have much impact on management. By contrast, some are going to be very tenuous, and some are going to have a big impact on management. When you have an assumption that's both tenuous and has a big impact on management, it's mission critical information. Biological planning is the mechanism by which we determine whether or not we've got an assumption that is, biological planning is the mechanism by which we determine what our uncertainties are, what we're making assumptions about. We're forced to confront them, and then we can do a separate assessment through a sensitivity analysis and through just plain common sense of how big is the impact on management, decisions that we're ultimately making, and how confident are we in that assumption. Without doing that, we fall into the trap, I fear, that we did for years, where science and management were separate entities. And administrators who had to pay for management viewed science as an expensive luxury. And this process of planning integrates science and management. Let me give you an example here. Again, for something we deal with in the Prairie Pothole region all the time. There's tremendous variability in duck nesting success, but there appears to be a relationship between the amount of grass in the landscape and nesting success, and it appears to be a positive relationship. But because it can be, at the same site, you can vary from 5% to 45% in 2 adjacent years. There's a lot of noise in the system. And the simplest relationship that you can draw between the two is a basic linear relationship. So if we make the assumption based on uncertainty about the nature of the relationship between the amount of grass and landscape and nesting success, that it is a linear relationship, it doesn't matter where we put grass. A conservation strategy would be to put grass wherever we want to, because we're going to get the same incremental increase in nesting success. Always going to be the same. But what if it isn't linear? What if we have nesting success that's non-linear and looks something more like this in its relationship to grass and landscape? Where would we put grass in that case? We'd put it where the slope of the line tangent to the curve is the steepest, because that's where we're getting the biggest increase for our investment. In other words, that's where our management is most efficient. And when we reach that asymptote, where it starts to flatten out, we'd move on to other areas, because increasing the amount of grass in those landscapes at that point, unless there's a compelling reason to continue to work there, is giving us less and less return, to the point where we're almost getting no increase in nesting success for the additions of grass to the landscape. Conversely, if we had a situation where the shape of the relationship looked like this, what would the strategy be? Think about it for a second. What would you do if you were confronted with a relationship that looked like this? You put all of your grass in one spot until you reached 100%, and then you'd move on to another area. Because the more grass you put in the area, in the landscape, the faster nesting success increases. So your benefit increases as the percent grass in the landscape increases. And in fact, the relationship may be very complicated. It may look like this, which calls for 2 different strategies in different kinds of landscapes. Perhaps avoiding putting grass in very low grass dense landscapes, and putting grass in those areas where the linear part of the curve is the steepest in landscapes that have some grass. So understanding the shape of that relationship is both the relationship itself, our understanding of it is very tenuous, but by the same token, it has a huge impact on where we do management. So it qualifies by our definition as mission critical information. Got one more example for you of mission critical information. South Dakota, they pull out shelter belts. Well know what shelter belts are, and they find that they have a big impact on grassland nesting birds. Conversely, in Minnesota, when we remove scattered trees, we don't find that we have an impact on grassland birds. The birds simply don't increase in the landscape. So we have a geographic component there, and we have shelter belts versus scattered trees. We can create a 2x2 matrix, and we need to evaluate each of those cells because it costs us a lot of political capital when we remove trees. Duck hunter or deer hunters and pheasant hunters don't like it. So, finally, 2 more slides. LCC accountability then assumes 4 forms. Did we get the outcome we expected for a particular project? By monitoring, as Jeff pointed out, a subset of those projects, we can refine our models and then use our models for all of our projects to estimate what our outcomes were. What are our project accomplishments, and are we progressing toward our large-scale objectives at range-wide scales? Apply those same models to remotely sensed data like satellite imagery. Are our model assumptions sound? That's the assumption-based research that we just looked at with our example of duck nesting success in relation to the amount of grass in the landscape. And then lastly, one we hardly ever hear about is when an LCC exists and we spend a couple $1 million on research, or a joint venture exists and we spend a couple $1 million on providing science. Are we actually affecting management? I'm not aware that anybody has ever assessed that. And that's a critical assumption as well, that bringing science to management is actually making management more efficient. Maybe it's not. It needs to be evaluated. So all of those, in my opinion, are high priorities for LCC-funded projects. Building models for biological and hydrologic planning, operational monitoring of projects to refine models. I don't know what the role of LCCs is on that. I think there needs to be more discussion. Maybe it's the management agencies themselves that need to be responsible for that monitoring. And the LCCs simply roll that up into the refinement of models. Evaluating model-based assumptions. I mean, assumption-based research. That enables us to refine our conservation strategies. And then finally, assessing the value added of joint ventures or the LCC to the conservation enterprise. Are they actually doing what we think they're doing? So that went a little longer than I thought. Is there time for any discussion?
Yeah, there is. We've got a few minutes, and Rex, you brought up a lot of great, thoughtful perspectives on this. I hope there's some folks out there that have some questions they'd like to pose to you. We'll open it up. Anybody on the call that wants to ask Rex anything in particular that didn't get brought up? We lost some folks here, Rex. But
Rex, this is Steve. I guess I just want to reiterate what Mike said. I think you've given us a viewpoint that really we can contemplate of how we can move some of these accountability issues into an application of conservation delivery. So I just want to thank you for bringing this forward.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity because I think accountability is one of the things that the LCC really exists for, and accountability should be one of the things that we consider. Can we be more accountable when we decide whether or not a project is something that we want to fund? It doesn't facilitate that question of accountability.
I think all of our agencies are being faced with accountability issues, especially in shrinking budgets and tight dollars and more competing uses of the landscape. I think we have to show where we're being effective.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And other questions for Rex?
Yeah, this is Mike Larson. I have a question. I could pose my own answer to it, but it goes back to a question I think it was Justin or Jeff asked earlier on about monitoring. What's the difference between going back to the beginning of your talk, talking about having activity-based objectives versus having outcome-based objectives when you're monitoring success using a model where the only variable might be, or the primary variable is habitat acres?
Well, very seldom would there be an objective where that would be a model where habitat acres would be the structure of the model. The structure of the model is usually going to have a variety of covariates included in it, and hopefully it'd be a better predictor than simple acres of habitat. So that would be my quick response to that.
Right, good point. And I guess the reason I bring it up is to give you an opportunity to say that, because some of the examples you gave may have given the impression that habitat acres, for example, is primary or only variable. And then the other side of it, too, is those nonlinear relationships with habitat acres.
Right, yeah. No, I think we want to be parsimonious in our models. We don't want to include variables that we don't need, but we want models that don't ignore important habitat relationships that go beyond just the size of the total amount of habitat that you restored. That said, if you can't do anything else, and that's the only model that you have, go ahead and use it, but express it in terms of numbers of organisms that you create a capacity to support, not in terms of acres of grass restored. Congress doesn't care how many acres of grass we restore. That's not our mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I don't think it's the mission of any of the states in the LCC either.
Anyone want to ask a last question of Rex? All right, Rex, I do want to really thank you again for giving us this PowerPoint. It was very thoughtful and helpful. I think it helps actually frame up the discussions this fall at the workshop as well. And related to that, Max mentioned earlier that he would be sending out a couple of doodle polls for those folks who've said they were going to participate, and we'll probably send those broader than that, Max. But in the next week or two, is that right? Relative to these two conference calls coming up?
Yes.
Okay. And so folks can watch for that. Next month, I think we're going to be hearing from one of our other projects that's being funded through the North Central Climate Science Center, and it has to do with some sage-grouse efforts in northeastern Montana. With that, thanks again, Rex, for leading us today, and I look forward to talking to everybody here in about another month as we get geared up for the fall workshop.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.